Thanks a lot, Matilda. So I'll just finish off our presentation by returning to sort of the beginning of the book, as it were, the chapter on memory of Katyn in Poland. The first thing I would say about that is that, well, the chapter focuses on commemoration of the massacre in Poland and in emigre communities, and also on literary representations. So in that sense, the second half kind of complements the chapter about the film. The first thing I would say is that the kind of cultivation of the memory of Katyn in the post-war decades was very much a dialogue between Poles in Poland and Poles outside of Poland, in North America, particularly in London. It was in kind of researching the efforts that were made to keep that memory alive, to cultivate that memory, there were so many fascinating and often tragic, often very touching stories of sort of individual and collective courage. And very much in the face of adversity, not only in Poland for obvious reasons, but also in the West. You know, the story of the attempts to build a monument in London, for example, in the 1970s, which were constantly obstructed by the British government and by local authorities, you know, in London. It took very many years to build that monument, and when it was built, it couldn't name the perpetrators of the crime. This is in London, you know, during the Cold War, at this kind of height of the Cold War. And that was just one part of this kind of very much a very international story of promoting the Katyn, the memory of Katyn. I looked, part of that dialogue was also underground press, so materials being produced illegally in Poland, but also coming in from the West, you know, so materials important texts or collections of documents such as the Zbrodnia katyńska w świetle dokumentów edited by Mackiewicz, which were produced in the West but also came back into Poland and very much circulated in the underground press in Poland. And this story of keeping his memory alive was a very kind of multi-dimensional story. It was written by a whole range of different actors, from writers to politicians in the West, to people creating their own sort of embryonic institutions within Poland, so kind of small precursors to the Institute of National Memory in some ways, but very much sort of grassroots and unofficial institutions dedicated specifically to Katyn. The role of the Katyn families, of course, can also not be underestimated. The story, for example, we discuss in the chapter the story of the so-called Dolinka Katyńska in Wawrzyniak cemetery. It's an extremely interesting story of a very dynamic site of memory, a very contested, very quickly changing place in which memory was inscribed and re-inscribed and erased and contested between individual actors resisting the state and the state, culminating, I guess, in this very dramatic illegal construction of a very large stone monument in the cemetery, which lasted for, was there for only one day. But these kind of stories are were fascinating to research, and also I think very much testify to the power of memory, not to kind of shape identities and the importance of memory in shaping identities, but also the importance of memory for power and the kind of fear that the regime, the authorities had of memory, as well as the power of memory to sort of facilitate political and social change. And I think it's certainly not an exaggeration to say that the cultivation of the memory of Katyn in the context of a wider sort of oppositionist memory discourse was very much an important element of the processes which led eventually to the disintegration of the communist system. A couple of words about representations as well, maybe to continue from what Matilda was saying. I was looking at mainly at literature. And what was very interesting in researching this was that there was a certain lack, actually, of material, of an event which is of such huge importance in Polish collective cultural memory, is not very well represented in the literature. There are many individual works of literature dedicated to this topic, but there are very few, let's say, substantial works of literature dedicated wholly to this topic. One finds often Katyn represented in kind of hidden, indirect ways, in, let's say, plays by Tadeusz Kantor, for example, in Miłosz's work. And an interesting question was, why should this be the case? I tried to kind of address that question in the chapter. I mean, the first thing to note, of course, is the nature of the Katyn massacre itself, which was a sort of witnessless event. There were no testimonies about the massacre. In a sense, it remained unknown. The moment itself of the actual killing of these people was not represented, was not remembered by anybody, just because of the way it happened. But there's also the issue of the kind of difficulty of representing such an extremely traumatic event. And this ties into many sort of ideas and theories of representing traumatic events. There's a lot written with regard to the Holocaust and this, where it's possible to actually represent these kind of things. And a lot of that, I think, is relevant in many ways to Katyn as well. And in looking at it, kind of two figures emerged as particularly interesting and particularly important in this story. One was Józef Mackiewicz and the other was Włodzimierz Odojewski, who represent very, very different approaches to representing the past and representing Katyn. Mackiewicz, obviously, a very, very much a historically orientated writer who was very interested in facts, in accuracy, in portraying the historical reality as it really was, as closely as possible, and using the kind of the trappings of literature, of fiction, only to lend it emotional weight, to kind of back up the facts and the truth. Only the truth is interesting, he said. On the other hand, Odojewski, in his works on Katyn, what we get is this sense of not being able to know the event, of the event being inaccessible, of the failings of memory, or perhaps the tricks that memory plays on us. Odojewski very much recognizing the importance of memory for him. Remembering Katyn, not forgetting about it, was extremely important. He describes memory as being a manifestation of God. So he obviously has this very deep kind of respect for memory. But at the same time, his texts constantly express the difficulties of kind of catching hold of that memory. So there's a very interesting story which we discuss in the book, which is called The Wood Comes to Dunsinane Hill. I'm trying to remember that. I think it's Podunzynańskiemu Wzgórzu idzie las. I think that's the title. Which is an extremely complicated narrative, multi-layered, with multiple narratives, all telling a story about someone who possibly survived the Katyn massacre, who went on to tell his story to someone else. That person told his story to someone else. That person told his story yet to someone else. And in that process of retelling the past, Odojewski, similar names, although Etkind really expresses this kind of inherently mediated nature of cultural memory, which is always mediated via people, via various forms, memory media, in which process it becomes distorted, it becomes fragmented, it becomes almost impossible to really get at the truth of what happened, and there remains this sort of absence in the center of memory, this unknown, which I guess ties into, Vida's film was the text which really tried to fill in that gap with that final scene which Matilda talked about, to show really what happened. So I think maybe I'll finish there, and we can happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. I switch to Polish. Ja może zanim Państwu oddam głos, zrobię to za chwilkę. Dodam tylko jedną rzecz, że mieli Państwo teraz okazję posłuchać części o książce, części polskiej, ukraińskiej i białoruskiej, natomiast książka ma jeszcze część dotyczącą Rosji oraz państw bałtyckich, ale ponieważ nie ma z nami autorów, to mogą Państwo to przeczytać w książce.